allow people to take water that doesn't exist in a dry year, but that will be the case even in an average year. And what that means is that there does need to be significant rethinking of the use of water in the Murray-Darling Basin and how we can make better use of the water. Again, the cartoonist suggests that the basin plan isn't really adequate and that they should be concerned about humans not really planning adequately for the future. What can we do about it? Well, this is the good news. CSIRO and the energy market operator did an analysis nearly 2 years ago now of the cost of new electricity, and particularly relevant given the other strange statements made yesterday by our Commonwealth Government. This is the hard-nosed assessment by CSIRO and the energy market operator. The cost of new power from a large wind farm is now about $40 per megawatt hour, and the same is true of large-scale solar. The problem with wind and solar is that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't shine at night. So for them to be reliable supply, you need storage. The CSIRO AMO assessment of the cost of wind or solar plus enough storage to make it effectively firm capacity is about $60 a megawatt hour. By comparison, baseload gas, if we started to build new gas-fired plant now, would deliver electricity at an average price of about $90 a megawatt hour. If we built a new coal-fired power station, that would deliver electricity at a price of about $120 per megawatt hour. And that's without adding in any of the fanciful plans for carbon capture and storage, so that burning coal wouldn't rapidly increase our contribution to climate change. To put those figures in perspective, the current average wholesale price in the electricity market in the eastern states is about $80 a megawatt hour. So what is clear from those figures is that replacing existing capacity with large-scale wind and solar with storage will reduce average prices. Replacing it with new gas and coal-fired generation will significantly increase average prices. And it's a pretty hard sell for politicians to say, elect me and I promise to increase your electricity prices, but that's effectively what the government is now doing. There is a concern that renewables can't be scaled up to meet our needs, but I just wanted to give you some data. I mean, it's rare in the area of political analysis for data to intervene, but just let me trespass into that territory. Last year, wind and solar together supplied more than 50% of the total power consumption of South Australia. South Australia were attacked by Josh Frydenberg when he was Malcolm Turnbull's energy minister for investing in wind and solar, which he said would provide unreliable supply and high prices. In fact, the wind and solar from South Australia has been allowing them to export to Victoria when your old coal-fired power stations prove unreliable on hot summer days. And on average, they were breaking down at the rate of about one a week in the last summer. Renewables supplied more than half of all power to the eastern states grid at midday on the 11th of April. And AMO says that wind and solar could meet 75% of the needs of the national electricity market by 2025. Some academic analysts like Ellison, McGill and Diesendorf from the University of New South Wales have shown, doing an hour-by-hour analysis of the electricity market, that all our needs could be met from a mix of renewables if that was what we wanted to do. Three academics at the ANU, Ken Baldwin, Andrew Blakers and Malcolm Stock, did an analysis for producing enough storage to allow wind and solar to meet all our electricity needs. They suggested investing in small-scale pumped hydro. They identified 22,000 possible sites for off-river pumped hydro, basically two small turkey nest dams where you use the solar and wind when it's available to pump water uphill, the higher dam, and allow it to run downhill and generate hydroelectricity when you need it. Of those 22,000 possible sites, you would need to use only the best 50 to have enough storage to allow us to run 100% on wind and solar. In case you're worried about the water demand, it would require about 1,000th of the water that's now extracted for irrigation, and the total cost would be similar to the business as usual approach. And just to illustrate that this sort of analysis is taken seriously, even by coalition governments, the coalition government in New South Wales has a roadmap for its future electricity generation, which shows 89% of their power in 2040 coming from wind and solar plus storage. And they've called for commercial tenders to build 8 small-scale pumped hydro stations to provide that storage. And in terms of what's happening around the world, these are the figures for the last year. In that year, new coal, 30 gigawatts, new gas, 40, hydro, 12, wind, 60, solar, 97. Basically, the world has moved on from the delusion that you need gas and coal to provide reliable electricity and is investing rapidly in wind and solar. So, just to make one final comment, that the problems we face aren't simply those of climate change and energy. The World Economic Forum, which is the big end of town at the global level, held a summit on the global agenda in Dubai in 2008, shortly after the global financial crisis. And in their final statement, they said that the recent crises of fuel, food and finance were the canaries in the mine, the early warning signals that our current economic system is simply not sustainable. And the comment they were making is that the entire economic system is predicated on the presumption that every year the economy will grow. Every year you will use more resources. Every year you will make larger demands on natural systems. And in principle, they were saying that growth can continue in the short term, but growth cannot go on forever in a closed. So the conclusion is that if we're serious about slowing down climate change, keeping the planet habitable, maintaining our capacity to grow our food, and so on, clean energy can and must replace fossil fuel. It should be a priority to use energy more efficiently because, as I said to Robert in the podcast that we taped on Saturday, the American analyst Amy Lovins famously said, people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. They want the services, the benefits that energy gives us. And from the point of view of the consumer, it doesn't really matter whether it's the sun or gas or coal-fired electricity that's producing the hot water in your shower. And if your refrigerator is, as a typical European one, is twice as efficient as the average one sold in Australia, you're only using half the amount of electricity to keep the beer cold and stop the butter melting. And that's a win for the consumer as well as a win for the environment. Final point, unlimited growth is not possible in the closed system. So sooner or later, we have to deal with population growth and consumption. And we have to recognise that keeping the planet habitable will, in the final analysis, require both stabilising the human population and stabilising our per capita demands. And if we don't deal with that in socially acceptable ways, the population will eventually be stabilised or reduced by starvation and disease and fighting amongst ourselves. And I think most of us would like to see a better future than that for our children. End of sermon, and we've got nearly 25 minutes for questions and cries of despair or shouts of anger.
Thank you, Ian. Could you turn your sharing screen off, thanks, Ian?
Yes, so stop share. Stop share?
Yeah.
That should have stopped
good. Thank you. So lots of thoughts there for questions. So anybody got a question they'd like to ask Ian? Thanks.
I might start, Rob.
There you go, John.
As a regional community here, we're always on the lookout for opportunities. We see renewable energy and the requirements of our community here as an opportunity. And things change. We've been looking at hydrogen. We're certainly looking at large-scale solar. Wind isn't one of our strong suits here in Shepparton. But is there anything on the agenda coming up or anything out there that we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, I mean, you're right that where you are, solar and ways of storing energy are the most obvious things to think about. Um, I remind people that electricity is only about a third of our contribution to climate change. About another third is transport, and another third is agriculture and manufacturing and a range of small scale uses. So if we're serious about meeting our emissions reduction target, that is now, it's a legal obligation. We signed the Paris Agreement, so that's an international treaty. We don't just have to clean up our electricity, but we also have to do something about transport relatively soon. And if you think about individual mobility, there's only two ways of propelling that. Either we store renewable electricity in batteries and use electric vehicles, or we convert the renewable electricity, use it to split water into hydrogen and oxygen and run vehicles on hydrogen fuel cells. And all of the major vehicle manufacturers around the world are investing in both of those options, both electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. And there are several European countries that have now legislated dates beyond which you will not be able to buy new petroleum fueled vehicles, either petrol or diesel, in some cases 2025, in others 2030. So thinking about how you harness renewable energy and how you use it to develop transport vectors, you know, either by storage or producing hydrogen, they're the obvious ways to go. The great thing about renewable energy, like solar or wind, is that it occupies quite a small land footprint, and it's entirely possible for landholders to produce a new income stream from these renewable energy forms without doing much damage to the principal income generation that they do from using their land, whether it's for grazing or cropping.
Thanks, Ian. Another question.
Yeah, it's Terry Court here, Ian. Of those 22,000 pumped hydros, how many of them are actually along the coastline using seawater, or isn't that considered an option?
It is an option, but they were looking entirely at land-based ones, you know, where you just build two dams. The thing is, you need a few hundred meters of height difference, and there are a few places along the coast where there are quite high cliffs or hills relatively near the coast, but generally it's easier to find that difference in gradient if you move inland a bit. But the thing that really struck me is that the total amount of water you need to use is only about 1,000th of the water we now use for irrigation. So it's entirely possible, even in the driest inhabited continent, to think about using water storage. I'm a bit sceptical about Snowy 2.0 because that's a very large-scale pumped hydro scheme, and the financial calculations I've seen don't look very promising. But the government seems to see that as a flagship project that's a legacy of a former Prime Minister, so it's probably going ahead.
Just another one then, Ian. Water sensitive, from where we come from, extraordinarily sensitive, right?
Yes.
It's a hanging charge to use it sort of inappropriately. But what about hydrogen production from biomass? You know, surely that is a pathway through as well.
Absolutely, and I think I mean there's serious trials going on in areas like producing aviation fuel from biomass. That there's enormous amounts of biomass out there, and at the moment we don't use it very intelligently. The other comment I make about water use is that I'm not sure it's an issue where you are, but I drove through the Murrumbidgee last year, and in most of that area, the irrigation water is still flowing through shallow open channels from the river to the farm. And so probably more water is evaporating than is actually used when it gets to the farm. There is an advanced modern technology called the pipe, which the Romans invented, so it's had a pretty fair field trial, and it dramatically reduces evaporation losses. And it seems to me that if we're serious about maintaining agricultural production in the Murray-Darling Basin while keeping the river healthy, we really should be investing in that advanced modern technology, the pipe, and making much better use of the water we take out of the river.
Just a comment and a question, Ian. You're in dangerous territory here. You've got a few water people. Pipes don't make much sense in our big water systems at all. They're not a very efficient, and actually evaporation is not a great part of the water loss in our systems. It's surprisingly, it's very small. It's sort of leakage and seepage are the main issues, and probably theft as well. But anyway, we won't go there. But anyway, I'll come to a question. Hydrogen, export of hydrogen to Asia. Do you see that taking off? Do you see that as potential as in the Northern Territory accelerating PV collection of energy, converting it to hydrogen and exporting it, or is that not an option?
No, I think it's a very serious option. I mean, it's quite accurately said that Australia only accounts for about 1.4% of global emissions. But at the moment, our exports of coal and gas more than double that. And so we're punching well above our weight in terms of our contribution to climate change by exporting fossil fuels that are contributing to the problem. And I'd be very happy if instead of exporting fossil fuels like thermal coal and fracked gas, we were concentrating on exporting hydrogen or exporting electricity. I mean, there's an undersea cable connecting Tasmania to Victoria, and it's entirely feasible to have an undersea cable connecting northern Australia to Papua New Guinea, to Indonesia, to Timor-Leste, and export clean electricity. So I think we should be thinking about the possibility of being a clean energy superpower rather than, as we have been in recent years, a fossil fuel superpower.
What do you say about public transport, Ian?
I beg your pardon?
You got any comments about public transport?
Well, the obvious comment about public transport is that an unusually small amount of Australia's urban transport by the standards of advanced countries is public transport. An unusually high fraction of Australian urban dwellers get to and from work, to and from the shops, to and from recreation, kids to and from school, by driving one or two to a car rather than using public transport. And public transport is much more energy efficient than driving one, or I think the figure for peak hour is on average about 1.05 to a car. We also should be making better provision for walking and cycling in our cities. So there are quite civilized European cities where the majority of all urban trips are made on foot or by bicycle. And that's because of better design, planning so that the services that people use every day are within a kilometre or so of where they live. If you look at the outer urban areas of cities like Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, they might have been designed to ensure that none of the services that people use every day are within walking or cycling distance. And so people are condemned to being 2, 3 or 4 car families just to access the conveniences of living in a 21st century city. So we really should be investing in better public transport. It's, I think, almost a public scandal that we still don't have good high-speed rail between our major cities like Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. And as a result, before the COVID pandemic, hundreds of thousands of people were travelling by air, distances that in Western Europe are much more efficiently covered by high-speed rail. And we should be reinventing urban planning. I mean, the neoliberal economic agenda has made planning almost a dirty word, as if it's somehow interfering in the market. But if you go back to Adam Smith inventing economics in 1776, he said that to have an effective market, you need good regulation and government planning to ensure that the market efficiently distributes resources. And so we really need to be thinking about I mean, cities like Melbourne and Sydney are talking about population continuing to increase for the next couple of decades. We should be thinking about how we plan those increases so that more people are able to use public transport or cycle rather than driving one to a car.
In talking before about mining, there's evidently 200 million tonnes of graphite in South Australia, which we don't mine at present, but that's a substance which is needed for a lot of electric cars, iPhones, etc., to make the batteries. How do we get perhaps that on the agenda so that we mine something which would be useful and will go into the future?
That's a very good question. I mean, governments can change behaviour by regulating, saying, you know, you shall mine graphite or you shall build a gas-fired power station, or they can affect behaviour by changing the economic incentives. And if we were serious about having a better future, we'd think about what economic incentives would encourage people to do things which are good for the community, and what economic disincentives would discourage them from doing things that are bad. We've applied that approach, for example, to radically reduce the number of people who smoke in shared space by making it a very expensive habit. And if we're serious about stimulating the activities that we would like to see, then we should be providing economic incentives, and we should be providing penalties for things like opening a new coal mine in the Galilee Basin, rather than going out of our way to make it more economically attractive, as the Queensland and federal government are doing at the moment.
Be really radical like Norway and develop it from a federal government and actually get the money for us like their sovereign fund did from oil.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very interesting point. I was giving public presentations in the 1980s about similar activity in Canada, the Alberta Heritage Trust Fund, where the Canadian province of Alberta recognised that oil and gas would be a short-term benefit to the economy, and it was important not to fritter it away. So they established a heritage trust fund into which a percentage of the royalties from oil and gas production were going, and they appointed a board with directions to invest the money to provide for economic and job opportunities after the oil and gas were gone. And they invested in everything from plantation forestry to semiconductor manufacturing. And Norway very cleverly harnessed the revenue from the oil and gas in the North Sea, basically to establish a very wealthy state which has relatively low taxation but relatively generous provision of essential services like education and transport and healthcare, by using the profits from the one-off benefit of harvesting fossil fuels. I think an American economist said that she thought only Rwanda got a worse deal from international resource companies than Australia did. We've been very stupid in the way we've almost bribed international companies to take our resources away, rather than allowing them to use the resources, but in return getting a significant flow of revenue into the public domain. You might remember that when Kevin Rudd proposed a tax on super profits of a small group of mining companies, they spent millions of dollars advertising to suggest this was a threat to civilization as we knew it. And they didn't just get rid of the mining tax, they got rid of the Prime Minister. They destabilised the Rudd government and led to him being rolled by his colleagues. So that basically just underlined the fact that historically we've been very generous in giving away our resources, and almost frivolous in any attempt to use the benefits of that to build a better society.
And we will probably do it with the graphite and give it away too, even though there's, at present, China's the only place virtually, you know, they've got the world market just about, haven't they?
All right, so it would be characteristically generous to ensure that we entrench that position by giving them privileged access to it in return for all of the generosity they've shown to us in recent years.
Excuse me, we had a question from a fellow called Christine Holmes on my screen, but his name I've forgotten.
It's really Peter. Yeah, Peter Holmes here, Ian. Could you tell us how far away is Australia, seriously, from developing an electric vehicle networking, charging networking system? It seems to me that we're developing very slowly compared to Asia and Europe. So is there some light at the end of the tunnel on this one?
Well, basically, it's up to the states who are responsible for transport infrastructure, and some are making a small effort. I mean, you're right about overseas. 3 years ago, I was planning a trip to the UK, and I was considering the possibility of renting a vehicle when I was there. And when I looked at the options, by far the cheapest vehicle to rent was a Nissan Leaf, which is a small electric vehicle. And I wondered if that meant that there was a good enough network of support for that to be a feasible alternative. And so I did some research using Dr. Google, and what I found was that on the major traffic arteries like the A1 and the A4, there were charging stations about every 10 or 20 kilometres, and about every 100 kilometres there was a so-called supercharging station. In the standard one, your vehicle could be recharged overnight. In the supercharging station, it could be recharged in half an hour while you're having a sandwich and a cup of coffee. So it's entirely feasible to be a tourist in the UK getting around using an electric vehicle. I know that there are charging stations in the centre of Adelaide because I've seen them. And I know that the Queensland government said a year ago that they were going to invest in an electric vehicle route from Brisbane to Cairns. So it is apparently now feasible to drive up to the eastern seaboard of Queensland using an electric vehicle. But I haven't seen much by way of charging stations in regional Australia. And so at the moment, it would be a brave person living in regional Australia who bought an electric vehicle. Going back to what I said earlier, if governments want to change behaviour, they have to support the behaviour they want to encourage. So I think it would be quite reasonable, given electric vehicles are one of the alternatives and electric vehicles are now available for purchase, it would be sensible for our state governments to be investing in the infrastructure to make it realistic to drive hundreds of kilometres and still be able to recharge your vehicle and get back home.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, we have a question from Alfred, thanks.
Ian, you've got a bit of a waste problem here in Australia. In Europe, they burn their waste, and in the middle of Vienna, there's a huge, big waste facility that happily burns all the city's waste and makes a lot of energy. Is that something we're considering here, or?
I don't know if we're considering it, but we should. I mean, I remember going to a conference on urban waste processing in Europe when I was working in the UK, and the average calorific value of urban waste is not worse than brown coal, which people burn to produce electricity in the sovereign state of Victoria. So it's entirely reasonable. But the other issue about urban waste is some figures I saw recently suggest that a significant fraction of urban waste is compostable materials. And it's probably more sensible with the food waste and food scraps that are going out in municipal garbage to think of composting that, producing methane and burning that rather than burning the fuel, because if we don't either burn the waste or compost it and burn the methane will gradually leak out of urban landfill and contribute significantly to climate change. The bottom line is that we produce, Australia produces among the top 3 or 4 in the entire OECD in terms of waste per person. And we should see waste as a resource rather than something we need to get rid of. And you're right, you can harness the calorific value of it, or you can look at processing it. Somebody also pointed out to me that the concentration of precious metals like gold in urban waste is now not much lower than that of deposits which are being mined. And he suggested that in future we'll see people mining urban landfills for the precious metals that are there in economically recoverable quantities.
With regards to composting, in the Netherlands they have been composting for about 50 years, but they exported the compost to East Europe. They have stopped that now because, well, they're burning it basically, and actually they are now importing waste. When there is not enough waste in the Netherlands, they import it from the east to top up their supplies for the furnaces.
Right, I suppose the good news is there's plenty of it there to import. Robert, I'm getting to the end of my time. They say in another place that they ask further questions to be placed on the notice paper for written answers. Could I say that if people have questions that I haven't had time to address, if they supply them to you and you supply them to me, I will undertake to provide written answers over the next day or so.
That'd be great. Thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming along, Ian. And let's all give him an applause. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Sorry, I've got to duck off early, but I have another commitment. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Well, thanks, folks. The question I was going to ask you again, should we continue with these Zoom meetings? Personally, I think they're really good because we get people such as Ian to come along. There'll be no way known we get him to come to Shepparton just for a 1 hour event, but he'll do it over Zoom. So
the answer for me is yes. The answer for me is yes, Rob. You're doing a wonderful.
Yes, please, Rob. Yes, please.
I'm getting thumbs up. So.
Thumbs up.
Absolutely. And just a plug for the SLAP website. If you've missed any of the Zoom meetings or would like to revisit them at all, on the SLAP website, the SLAP Tomorrow website, you can now see all the Zoom presentations